of Gethsemane. And this night, the explosion was this conflict between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. And we see the disciples scattering. We see the trouble that's erupted as some uninvited guests show up in the garden. And the mob now arrives to meet and arrest Jesus. We've seen in this last week with the arrest of Jesus, there were so many evil players involved in Jesus's arrest. We've got Judas, the selfish betrayer that would sell out Jesus for a pocket full of coins. We learned earlier in the evening that it wasn't just Judas, but Satan came and controlled Judas to execute this betrayal. And then the Jews were looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus, and they partner with Judas to finally capture Jesus. And they conscript a band of Roman soldiers, this mob of Roman soldiers, and they all show up in the middle of the night as Jesus and the disciples are there praying in the garden. They show up with weapons, they show up with torches, and they show up to arrest Jesus. And the question goes in my mind, what was going on in the minds of all these people that they would do such evil and come against the most righteous man that ever lives. And as the disciples of Jesus are praying in the book of Acts, they ask this rhetorical question. They say, why did the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed. For truly, in this city, the city of Jerusalem, there were gathered together against your holy servant, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. And they say, why did they rage against you and against your anointed? And then they answer their own question. They say, they did this to do whatever your hand, God, wanted done, and what to fulfill your plan that you had predestined to take place. Now, so as the disciples look at the arrest of Jesus, the trials of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, they see the wickedness of man coming against Christ, but also this reality that in that moment, God was executing his perfect plan that he had predetermined to take place. And before the arrest of Jesus, during the arrest of Jesus, and after the arrest of Jesus, the scriptures always point us back to this event that although evil people were doing evil things, God was working out his perfect plan. We remember that what the disciples said about Jesus being delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. They acknowledged that he was crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men, but this was to fulfill the plan of God. Jesus is, as he prepared the disciples for this moment in the garden, he told them, yeah, Satan's involved here, but don't get it wrong. Satan's got nothing on me. He says the ruler of the world is coming. He's coming and he's using Judas, but he's got no claim on me. What actually I'm doing here is I'm doing what the Father has commanded me. When Jesus confronts the most powerful of the Roman authorities during his arrest, he tells Pilate, you'd have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. And before Jesus' arrest, he made it plain. And nobody takes my life from me. I give it up on my own accord. Actually, I'm the one in authority in this situation. I'm the one that has authority to lay down my life. And as we saw the actual events of the arrest of Jesus last week, we saw that very clearly that Jesus was the one in charge. We saw that Jesus was fully aware of what was happening, the sequence of events, the players, the betrayers, what he was going to do, what his disciples were going to do. what his arresters were going to do to him. He was fully aware of what was going on, but then we also saw that Jesus, as the arrest was executed, Jesus was the one in full control. And it started out on that note as Jesus steps up and says, yeah, I'm Jesus, you're here to arrest me, and everybody falls flat on their backs. Right? The tone is set for the arrest. We see Jesus in full control. And then we see this surprising reality that in this moment, in this intense moment of Jesus's enemies coming violently against him, Jesus didn't fight. And looking back, we know why Jesus didn't fight is because he was fulfilling this plan of God, and he believed that God's strategic peace plan was worth dying for. He had set his mind resolutely to fulfill the plan of God, to serve as that sacrifice for the sins of God's people that would facilitate peace between God and man. And that strategic peace plan was worth dying for. Now, this takes us into the trials of Jesus. He's now been arrested. His disciples have fled. And now he's going to go through a series of trials. I want to call this God on trial. And as we look at this, as we look at the mob versus Jesus, I want to make some observations as we see Jesus interact with his accusers. And I want to look at the response or the actions of the righteous man versus the responses and actions of the mob. And I've set up the outline that you received a little bit differently today. We've got one category is the righteous man, and the other one is the violent mob. And it looks like a three-part series in print, but we're going to move through it fairly rapidly. Now, as we look at in all four of the Gospels and combine what they contribute to these trials, we see that Jesus actually goes through a series of 6 trials. He goes through 3 trials with the Jewish leaders. That's where it starts. 2 of them are before the sun even rises. And then Jesus goes through 3 Roman trials that ultimately ends in his crucifixion by the Romans. The first of the Jewish trials is with a guy named Ananias, and he's the former high priest. Then they bring him to the current high priest named Caiaphas, and others from the Jewish leadership join in. And then we see a third short trial just after daybreak with the same Jewish religious leaders finally making it legal. It's not during the middle of the night. And then we've got 3 trials with the Romans. We got Pilate, and then he sends him off to a guy named Herod Antipas, and then another one with Pilate. So there's a lot going on here with the trials that Jesus is going to go through before he's actually crucified. And woven in with these different trials, we also have Peter's denial of Christ and Judas's suicide. So there's a lot of action going on in these hours after Jesus is arrested and before Jesus is crucified. Now, I want to just for today look at the first 2 of these 6 trials, and this this happens right after Jesus is arrested, and they take Jesus to a guy named Annas. Let's read, picking up with Jesus's arrest in John chapter 18. It says, "So Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword back in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?' So the band of soldiers and their captain, their officers of the Jews, arrested Jesus, and they bound him. And they first led him to Caiaphas, for he was the father, or to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year." Now, there's not much notable about Annas, but they do point out who he was related to. Annas was the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. And the reason that they go to Annas first is because he's the former high priest, and he's kind of like the old guard. He probably is the one that actually has more respect and more authority within the group. his son-in-law now has taken over his position. But they bring Jesus first to this old school former high priest named Annas. Now, John points out right from the very beginning something that we saw earlier. He says that Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who is the current high priest. And John reminds us in verse 14 that it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, why do you think John is telling us who Annas's father-in-law is, and then pointing out this advice that Caiaphas had given back, I think, in John chapter 11? I think John is emphasizing what we've seen so far, that Jesus' arrest, Jesus' trials, and Jesus' crucifixion were all part of God's plan, right? Jesus says, what's happening now is me fulfilling the plan of the Father, drinking the cup that the Father has given me. And John reminds us right off the bat with these trials and these interrogators of Jesus that they're only fulfilling the plan that God has already laid out. Remember back when Caiaphas spoke up within that leadership group of the Jews. Remember back in chapter 11, and it was a really weird event. And Caiaphas spoke to that group, and he says, "You guys don't know anything at all, nor do you understand that it's better that one man should die for the people and not the whole nation should perish." So he's the one that advised the Jews to go after Jesus and seek to kill Jesus. And after this speech by Caiaphas, that's when they began to look for an opportunity to arrest Jesus. And Caiaphas wasn't trying to say this is God's plan for the salvation of the world. He was saying we got to kill that guy, and it's worth sacrificing him if we can retain power within our nation. But John tells us something that seemed very strange to me. He says that Caiaphas didn't actually say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. So God was actually speaking through this wicked high priest and foretelling, prophesying about Jesus's death for the nation of Israel, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And it's at that point they began to plot to kill Jesus. But John wants us to know that they're actually, even in their evil plotting, God is using their actions to fulfill his perfect plan for the salvation of those who have believed in the nation of Israel, and the salvation of those who are scattered abroad, the nations, the Gentiles who would believe in Christ, bringing us into one family. So as John points this out and reminds us of Caiaphas's prophecy, he's reminding us that God is in control of this. And when we think of the battle that's going on here, we've got the kingdom of darkness, the enemies of Jesus, just coming in, throwing punches, don't know what they're doing. And as we see God in this battle, God is more of a skilled kung fu fighter, and the skilled kung fu fighter will use the energy and momentum of their opponent to defeat their opponent. So as the evil people are making evil moves and evil punches, God's using their own momentum to fulfill his plan and win the victory. Now, he explains to us that as Jesus is arrested and taken to Caiaphas and begins to be, or Annas, and it begins to be interrogated by Annas, Jesus is not completely alone. In the garden, when Jesus was arrested, the disciples scattered. But now that Jesus has been taken and he's beginning to be tried and interrogated, John lets us know that actually Simon Peter and another disciple had circled back around and come to witness the trials. They were trying to get into the facility where Jesus was being tried there at Annas' place. And John says that Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that other disciple, which we'll find out it's John himself who's writing the book, since that other disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch of the door and brought Peter in. And then we have this interaction between the servant girl and Peter. It says the servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of those man's disciples, are you?" And we have this first sad denial of Jesus by Peter. He says, "No way. I am not." Now, John, traditionally in his book, he doesn't identify himself as John. He identifies himself in other ways as the disciple that Jesus loved. Here, he identifies himself as the other disciple. But what John is bringing out is that he was an eyewitness of these events. He was an eyewitness of Jesus' arrest in the garden. He may have ran away, but he's back, and he's an eyewitness of these trials of Jesus. And what he witnesses isn't very pretty, right? He gets to witness firsthand his leader, Peter, denying Jesus Christ. And this is the same Peter that just hours before or minutes before in the garden had taken out the sword and was willing to fight and die to protect Jesus. He had stood up to a crowd of hundreds who were armed. He was a brave man. And here we see Peter shut down and scared, denying Christ because of the questioning of a little girl. This is really a sad scene and something that will haunt Peter. And this is the first thing that John witnesses. Now, this was also prophesied by Jesus, promised by Jesus earlier in the night. And he at that time confronted some of Peter's pride when he said that all are going to fall away because of me this night. And Peter said, "No way. I won't fall away. They might." But Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say to you this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And here we see the first time, this first denial of 3. It gets a little bit worse for Peter, because Peter comes in. John uses his connections to get Peter into the facility. And John continues that now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. And Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. And then we flash into the house of Annas, and it says the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Now, I don't know, it doesn't specify exactly what servants and officers, but the only officers that I know in the story and that would be there in the middle of the night were the ones that had just arrested Jesus. And we now see Peter standing around the campfire with them and staying comfortable while the Lord is inside getting questioned. So we see Peter warming himself with Jesus' enemies while Jesus gets grilled in the other room. Really
hello.
A sad. Yes.
A tape measure?
Sad situation. Now, inside, Jesus is questioned, and he's questioned, it says first about his disciples. And I know this is standard procedure for police states, right? When when pastors in Jordan would be brought into the secret police, that was one of the main questions. Who's your people? Who do you want to tell us about? Who's in your congregation? Who are you working with? Jesus is questioned about his disciples. And then Jesus is also questioned about his teachings by Annas. And in the dialogue that comes after, we see Jesus says absolutely nothing about his disciples. He's not about to narc out his followers. That puts Jesus in a pretty strong contrast with Peter, who's out there having a campfire party with Jesus's enemies. He does go on to talk about his teaching and answer the questions about his teachings. And it says that the priest was questioning about his teachings. And what teachings do you think he was questioning Jesus about? I don't think it was about loving your neighbor. There was a particular teaching of Jesus that was really the reason for his arrest, the reason for their hostility against him, and the reason for his crucifixion. And they weren't really interested in his broader teachings, but very specifically about his self-claims, his claim to be the Son of God, his claim to be the Messiah, the Christ, the King, and his claim to be the Son of God that made him equal with God, and in their eyes, guilty of blasphemy. And from the very beginning, as the hostility grew against Jesus, John would point this out, that this was the reason the Jews were seeking to kill him, because calling himself God, he was making himself equal with God. And this is the teaching that they really want to question him about. They're going to bring up other things in these trials, but we see as the trials of Jesus and the accusations of Jesus compound, really what the Jews are mad about and what they want to kill Jesus for is because he himself claimed to be the Christ, the Son of God, equal with God, and in their eyes, this was blasphemy. Now, as they question Jesus, he doesn't give Annas much here. He just points to the openness with which he taught. He says, if you want to ask questions about my teaching, you don't need to ask me. What you need to do is just ask all the people that heard me, including a bunch of people here sitting in this room. It says, Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews came together. I've said nothing in secret, so why do you even ask me? Ask those who have heard me, heard what I've said to them. They know what I've said. Everybody knew what Jesus had taught. He wasn't retracting anything that he said, but at this point, he's not even going to defend himself. He says, I've taught publicly. It's on the record. Go ask the people that I've taught. And at this point, we start to see Jesus, the righteous man's mode of operation. This first glimpse of how Jesus is going to deal with the violent mob, this riotous mob, this bloodthirsty mob that is out for his blood. Now, his MO is speaking openly, saying nothing in secret, and telling the truth. And this mode of operation is the same mode that's prescribed for us as believers, as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus, telling the story of Jesus, offering the mercy of God to sinners through faith in Jesus. The Apostle Paul says that this is our same mode of operation. He says we refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. This becomes the mode of operation. It was the mode of operation of Jesus, open statement of truth, and the prescribed mode of operation for Jesus's followers. We talked in previous sermons about our open statement of the truth, calling a spade, calling sin, in the culture that we live in. But this open statement of the truth that Jesus is on trial for, and that the Apostle Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians, is a different card that's been played. This is open statement about the truth, calling a king a king. This is about the identity of Jesus and Jesus himself presenting himself as the king. And then we, as we go to tell people about Jesus, we openly stating the truth, clear and plain, about the kingship, the authority and the supremacy of Jesus Christ. That's what Paul is talking about when he says we openly state the truth. We proclaim not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as what? Jesus Christ is the Lord. Jesus Christ is the master. Jesus Christ is the authority. Jesus Christ as the king, and ourselves as servants for his sake. We expose the same truth that we've known and the same knowledge that we've understood, the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We expose Jesus' supremacy and his kingship in the clearest, open, most public terms possible. And I want to offer this as the first characteristic of the righteous man, what we see Jesus doing, and then how we're encouraged to follow in his footsteps. The righteous man speaks publicly and on the record about Christ's supremacy. The righteous man speaks publicly and on the record about Christ's supremacy. And this is the issue of the day in Jesus' arrest and his trials, is his supremacy, his identity, his kingship, and his lordship. Finally, in one of the other trials, they get around to it and they stop beating around the bush. They say, we adjure you by the living God, tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God. This is the issue. This is what we really want to know and we want to kill you for. And Jesus doesn't shy back at this point at all. He doesn't deflect the question. What he says is, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds. Yeah, he's not shy to speak publicly and on the record about his supremacy. Now, they didn't really like Jesus's answer. I've taught publicly. Why don't you go ask somebody that heard me? One of the officers, it says, struck Jesus with his hand, saying, how is it that you answer the high priest? So his soldier smacks Jesus in the face and rebukes Jesus for offending this high priest, this highest level leader within Judaism and the nation of Israel. And Jesus doesn't really have any sympathy for the high priest's office. He doesn't have respect for this high priest. Actually, Jesus is the highest person in the room. He's the highest religious authority in the room. And Jesus tells him, hey, you're going to slap me in the face for what I said. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why are you going to strike me? And we see in Jesus that truth trumps personalities and positions. He doesn't really care who he's talking to. He is going to speak the truth. This is here with the highest religious leader within Judaism. As the trials continue, where he's going to find himself in front of the most powerful Roman leader in Jerusalem, and he still it doesn't matter who he's talking to, he's going to promote truth, and he's also going to promote his identity as the king. And Pilate asked him in this final trial, are you a king? And Jesus said, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness of the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. For Jesus, it didn't matter who he's talking to. He's going to tell the truth. He's going to speak the truth, and he's going to promote himself as the king. This is the second example we get from Jesus, that the righteous man stays the course and makes truth the issue. He's not afraid of who he's talking to. He's not afraid of how they're going to react. He stays the course and he makes truth the issue. And we see this all the way from his first trial with Annas all the way to the 6th trial with Pilate. He's always bringing them back. He's not letting them distract with all these side arguments and false accusations. He's always bringing them back to his sovereignty, his supremacy, and the supremacy of truth. He's always bringing them back to his identity and the truth of the gospel. Now this ends the first trial. Jesus doesn't give Annas much other than a little bit of lip, and rebukes them for their abuse. But this ends the first trial of Jesus. And they take him out and they take him now to Caiaphas, who's the active high priest. And now they've gathered the other leaders of Judaism, those that are in authority that will eventually call for Jesus's blood. And Matthew records that then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now, this is still the middle of the night, and this is an illegal trial. They're there to condemn a man and find him guilty. They want to condemn him to death. This is in the middle of the night. These guys are subverting justice by arresting Jesus in the middle of the night, and then now putting him on trial. But they've all gathered together to conspire against Jesus Christ. And this is the first observation I want to make about this violent, riotous mob, is that the riotous mob appeals to the law while subverting the law for their agenda. And we're going to hear them over and over making claims that Jesus has broken the law. But here, at the very outset of their trial of Jesus, they're breaking the law themselves. They're subverting justice because it fits their agenda. Now, the interaction between Jesus, the righteous man, and this riotous mob, this violent mob, reminds me of a lot of things that are going on today, but I don't want to detract from what Jesus is doing. But we see the same mentality and same strategy in the mob today as they would oppose those who are righteous as well. And here we see them appealing to the law, but subverting the law for their agenda. Now, Matthew wants to keep Peter in front of our view, so he tells us that Peter, now that Jesus has been moved from Annas to Caiaphas's place, Peter is still following at a distance, and he follows Jesus now, and he's sitting outside with the guards to see how it's going to turn out for Jesus. And it says, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. So not only are they meeting illegally, subverting justice by doing that, they're actively trying to find false witnesses to come up with something to accuse Jesus, something to justify their bloodlust to kill Jesus Christ. And they make quite an attempt, but they can find nothing. This is the second thing I wanted to point out about this riotous mob, that the riotous mob makes their judgment and then seeks the evidence to justify it. They've already judged Jesus. They've already decided what he deserves. Now they're just looking for any shred of evidence they can use to bury him, to justify their evil motives. Now, you probably aren't surprised, because this is Jesus, that they don't find any dirt. They don't find anything that they could legitimately accuse him of that would be worthy of any type of punishment, right? We've got the righteous man on the other side of the room being tried. They find absolutely nothing. And now, looking at this trial and thinking about imitating Jesus and following in Jesus's footsteps, if we're going to stand up to the mob, if we're going to stand up to the critics, if we're going to stand up to the adversaries, we really, really, really need to be like Jesus. And one thing that you won't find in Jesus's closet is skeletons. They looked, they had been watching him, scrutinizing his whole ministry up until this point, and they could find absolutely nothing to point out and to call him a hypocrite. He had zero skeletons in his closet, and really that must be our MO if we're going to follow in his footsteps as righteous men and women, especially when it comes to standing up to the adversaries of Christ. And Peter, who observed all of this that night, he says to us as believers, if we want to represent Christ in the world, he says, you guys have to follow in the footsteps of Christ in this way. Keep your conduct amongst the unbelievers honorable, so that when they speak evil against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. That as we follow in the footsteps of our Lord, who was above reproach and above accusation, that we live honorable as we interact with unbelievers in our public life and our personal life. So when push comes to shove and we're on trial, they can find no accusations against us. All they would see instead is our Christian love and good deeds. And as a result, God would get the glory. Now, this is a third thing I want to observe about Jesus, the righteous man. The righteous man builds integrity as his greatest defense. Jesus doesn't even have to say anything at this point. They're just trying to take shots at him and missing every time. And that's because the righteous man builds integrity as his greatest defense. Make all the accusations you want. If you're a Christian who has integrity, nothing's gonna stick. Integrity is the greatest defense. Now, they actually did find a few false witnesses that came up with something, and this is really a lame accusation, and this is the only time they make this accusation in the trials, because it's really irrelevant in court when it comes to the Romans. The last two came forward and they said, this man, Jesus, said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men are testifying against you? And here we see Jesus doesn't even answer this accusation, but Jesus just remains silent. Now, they do make this accusation. It's actually sort of true what they're saying. You remember Jesus did make this statement, destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will rebuild it. And he did that almost 3 years ago. And it's still in their head, and they're still throwing out this accusation against him. They just grabbed this soundbite from 3 years ago when Jesus cleansed the temple the first time and really made him mad. And then he made this comment. And back then, when he said this, they were arguing with him. Why do you think you have the authority to come and take control of our temple? And they said, what sign do you do what sign do you show us for doing these things? That you have this authority. And Jesus made that statement, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And what was Jesus talking about? Yeah, he was talking about kill my body and in 3 days I'll raise. And John clarifies that way back when the statement was originally made. John says that he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, then his disciples put all the pieces together. But his enemies are holding on to this soundbite from 3 years ago, and this is the only thing they can come up with to accuse Jesus. Actually, they stick with it all the way till Jesus is hanging on the cross, and they bring this thing up again, and they say, "Oh, you who destroyed the temple and rebuilt it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." And they still don't understand what he was talking about. If they did, I can imagine Jesus thinking as they're saying that, I'm in the middle of fulfilling what I said about destroy this temple and in 3 days I'm raised up. Well, you have to destroy the temple first by killing me. I'm doing exactly what I said. But they bring this charge against Jesus, and they collect these sound bites, and then they misrepresent them to fit their agenda. And this is the third thing I wanted to offer about what we see in the mob, in this violent mob, bloodthirsty mob. The violent mob collects sound bites and then misinterprets them to fit their agenda. Have you ever seen this happen in modern times? The violent mob collects sound bites and then misinterprets them to fit their agenda. Now, what the answer Jesus gives to this false accusation is absolutely nothing. He doesn't even give it enough credibility to give an answer. They push him to answer these charges, and Jesus just remains silent. And I want to offer this as the fourth thing that we see in Jesus that we should imitate. The righteous man knows when to argue and when to be silent. And we will see Jesus in these trials arguing, defending himself, promoting himself as the king, pushing for acceptance of the truth. But in this moment, Jesus chooses to remain silent because the righteous man knows when to argue and when to keep his mouth silent. Now, he does this one other time, and he does this in his trial with this guy named Herod. And Herod, from my perception and study in exegesis, I perceive that Herod is a jerk. But Jesus ends up being tried by this Roman leader named Herod. And Herod wanted to see Jesus. He was excited that Jesus was arrested and he got to be part of it because he had heard about Jesus, and he had heard specifically about Jesus's miracles, and he wanted Jesus to do a magic show. So he was really excited, and he was hoping to see some sign done by Jesus. And so he questioned him at length. He had all these questions for Jesus. And then what Jesus gave Herod? Absolutely nothing. He gives Herod zero. And Jesus gives him absolutely no answer. And I think it's because Jesus was applying the great proverb, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. And Jesus had judged Herod as a fool that doesn't deserve an answer. And Jesus had judged these false witnesses that were trying to convict him for what? Saying I'm going to destroy the temple. He had judged them as fools that it didn't deserve an answer as well. And really this first accusation against Jesus that he said he'll tear down the temple, this is a fool's accusation. And Jesus doesn't want to have anything to do with it, because as a righteous man, he knows when to argue and he knows when to keep silent. He's really waiting for the big issue, right? The big issue is his identity. It's not a soundbite. It's his identity as the Savior and the Messiah. And finally, they get to the point, and the high priest asks him, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus says to them, you have said so. And the way the ESV translates it sounds kind of weak, and you can't really tell what Jesus is trying to say. You've said so, but you might have a different translation in front of you. Some translate, you said it yourself. Yes, it is as you said, or it is as you said. This is Jesus's response to their questioning, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And I would translate like this, yeah, you got that right. This is what Jesus is pointing out. And in Jesus' simple response, there's both a confirmation of what they said, that yes, I am the Christ, the Son of God, but then also an incrimination of what they said. That they know exactly who Jesus claimed to be. That they weren't victims of confusion or misinformation, that they knew exactly that Jesus had claimed to be the Christ. He had demonstrated that he was the Christ. And despite that, despite them having full understanding of him and his claims, they were still turning against him. So he says, yeah, you got that right. That's who I am. But I want to tell you something else. He says, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds. So I want to expand your understanding here of what you've just got yourself into. You understood my claims to be the Christ. You've chosen to reject me and come against me. But I got to tell you, there's more coming. What you're going to get from this point on is you're going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And you remember back in the garden, Jesus, when Judas came up, he said, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And Jesus emphasized his identity as the promised king who would rule over all. I remember the vision of the Son of Man, the one whom God on his throne had given all dominion and glory and a kingdom. And Daniel has this vision of the Son of Man and his power being given to him, and then how that plays out in history. And Daniel's vision of the Son of Man ends in the future. He says that his kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. The end. This is the end of the story. The Son of Man is the one who is served, and the Son of Man is the one who is obeyed. And Jesus is pointing out, I am the Son of Man. I am the one that's going to be served and obeyed by all. And now you're coming against me. You're seeking to be my judge. You sit and judge me. You guys have lost your mind. I am the judge. I tell you what you're going to see from now on as those that oppose me is my power. I imagine Jesus looking them in the eyes saying, are you guys serious? You want to go down this path with God's appointed ruler of all? You want to sit and try and judge me? I am the judge. I'm the king. And he's telling them, laugh now because you're not going to be laughing then. You might have your moment right now as you seek to abuse me and convict me and falsely accuse me, but things are going to change. And he points them to the future. He says, what you're going to see, the next thing you see when you open your eyes is you're going to see me seated at the right hand of power. And then you're going to see me coming on the clouds of heaven. He points them forward to his victorious resurrection that's going to take place 3 days later. So, and the apostles, when they're preaching to the Jews about their foolishness of rejecting the Messiah, they say that the God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging on the tree. God has exalted him to his right hand. Jesus Christ has now been exalted to the right hand of power, and you betrayed him. Hebrews tells us that Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice, and he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting for the time until his enemies will be made a footstool. Who are his enemies? Well, his first enemies are those in the room at this trial, those that are coming against him, rejecting him, and calling for his blood. Jesus is seated at the right hand of God now, and he's waiting. And he's waiting for this second phase. He's waiting for his coming. He says, you who are opposing me right now, that's what you're going to see. That's what you're going to get to observe, me in my power, not just of resurrection and exaltation, but me in my power, in my return. The book of Revelation talks about his return, his soon return to earth, and that every tribe will see him Every eye will see him, even those whom he has pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. He's saying to his enemies, you set yourself against me right now, but what you're going to get is you're going to be amongst those wailers who are going to see me in my power. And you see the power of Christ and the judgment of Christ on his enemies throughout the book of Revelation. And at the end of the 7 years of judgment, remember, immediately after that time of tribulation, there appears the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in the power and great glory. This is what they're going to see. And he warns them of the coming imminent danger that they're in rejecting him and his authority. This is the last thing I want to observe about the righteous man, that the righteous man knows the story's end, and he warns even the mob of imminent danger. He knows the story's end. He knows how it's going to play out, and he warns them. He warns them strongly right here that they're in serious danger in their rejection, opposition, and persecution of him. It says that they will see on this day, and they will mourn. This is exactly what Jesus says to them that night. That's you. This is your future. If you continue to rebel against me, what you're going to get is my powerful retribution. Now, it's a sad reality, but the way that they respond is with conviction. This is the high priest tore his robes, says, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is the judgment? And they answered, Jesus deserves death. So we see the mob, despite all the truth that Jesus has tried to give them, the riotous mob hates truth, even if it's to their own destruction. Their conclusion, standing for the most powerful, the most righteous man that ever lived, is that he deserves death. He is guilty. Now, this is Caiaphas, who makes who calls for the judgment of Jesus, and this is that same Caiaphas that made that prophecy back in John chapter 11, and it seems like a sad moment for Jesus, but we know, as those who know the end of the story, we know that this was actually a good day. Although evil men were making their evil judgments this day, Jesus's plan was right on track. Jesus was now in the perfect position to die for the nation and to die for us and gather us as God's children.